about the resurrection. Light and goodness has finally arrived. Yeah. Yep. All up to this point. I mean, God, that's great, but like not necessarily hopeful yet. So now Jesus being there, that ends up being hopeful. Anyways, this I think is one of my favorite talks because I think this can be one that like even though I still think that when we're doing apologetics, we need to go through those steps. We need to show them truth exists, God exists, Scripture is the Word of God, Jesus is God, or Jesus is God and Scripture is the Word of God. There is an amount that I think this argument in itself can be just so persuasive that I think some people who maybe aren't quite as deep thinkers as maybe some of us in this group, I don't feel like, especially you, even Matt, I think, where had you not been persuaded of other things before this wouldn't be that convincing. But I think for a lot of people, this by itself could totally persuade somebody. And then the other thing that I think is really great about this is ultimately in the end, so much of our faith just rides on this. So kind of to start off, one of the first things we need to talk about is like, all right, so we're talking about Jesus rising from the dead. Who cares? Why does it matter? And I think we can just see that abundantly clear that no other story and no other religion makes the claim that Christianity and Christ makes. So I can look at any other religion and their religious leader, and that religious leader isn't going to claim to be God. This is something that is wholly unique to the Christian faith, to have the founder of the religion claiming to be God themselves. Every other religion, you're going to have someone who's claiming to be a prophet, or in the case of the Buddhas, someone who reached enlightenment before anybody else and now can guide you to it better than anybody else because he's been there, but not because he's the one that created everything. Muhammad, in even a deeper sense, he's a prophet, but in a lot of ways, you would meet a lot of Muslims that would even claim that Muhammad didn't even do any miracles. And apart from the Quran itself, most Muslims would pretty much agree to that. They would say maybe the Quran itself is a miracle. And so Christ ends up making this much bigger claim, and so much of this rides on that. So in fact, no other religion stands on the existence of one man. We could look again at all of these other religions, and if the founder of that religion never existed, that religion could totally be there. Muhammad, even though he brings the Quran, Joseph Smith, even though he brings the Book of Mormon, if neither of those guys ever existed, that religion would still exist in its entirety without those men. And so it all rides on that, where Christianity, what we believe and how Christianity functions, if Christ never existed, the whole thing falls apart because our salvation rides upon his existence. And even furthermore, it rides upon him actually rising from the dead. So even if he's a historical character, but he never rose from the dead, the whole thing falls apart if he never actually rose from the dead. And this is something that's interesting from a lot of different perspectives, because now we're seeing something that makes Christianity very unique, but it also makes it very easy to prove that Christianity is false. Where other religions, I could somehow go about proving that Joseph Smith never existed. I could prove that Muhammad never existed. That doesn't mean that those religions are false. Now, that might in some ways make them sound to a lot of us like a more realistic religion. But when it comes to just examining facts, that's typically something that we would see as a way of that being less solid. That generally when you're looking to be able to prove the truth of something, being able to have something that you can disprove that truth is actually a factor that bolsters the believability of that truth. And so that all of it rides on this has so much significance just for the groundwork of it. So when I'm talking with people, one of the things that I like to point out is, hey, we're going to we're going to look at this and realize, all right, there's all these different religions. And a lot of people want to throw out, well, you have all these different religions. How do you know that Christianity is true? And why should I start by examining Christianity? Well, the two things that I end up pointing out to say, this is why I think you should start with Christianity above any other religion. One, Christianity, if it's right, has one of, if not the largest penalty in the end, if it turns out that you don't believe it and it's true. Buddhism, Hinduism, you get a redo. Mormonism, you really get a redo. You basically go into heaven and then you're given the gospel again and you can accept it and get to the highest levels of heaven still. With Islam, maybe is the one other religion that if it turns out Islam's true and you didn't believe it, then you might not end up having eternity in heaven with God. But there's even room within Islam that even if you didn't accept Islam, but your good deeds outweigh your bad deeds, you still get into heaven. So reason number one is because if you're wrong about Christianity, it's good to start there. Second reason is it's the easiest one to just knock off. It's the easiest one to, in the end, just be able to say, well, I can prove that the resurrection never happened. That one's done. Now let's look at the other ones. So those are the things that I end up pointing out to people and why, again, think that this is such an important thing for us to kind of get into regarding giving the evidence for this. Any questions so far? Or thoughts? What?
I have one related to Pascal's research.
Okay. I mean, you can throw it out there if you want.
No, it's a more deeper later one.
Okay. So I'm going to show a video that's really going to give a really brief explanation of how we're going to go about this. And then I'm just going to go a lot more in depth to explaining this. This is one of those moments where just for your own sake to be able to kind of know resources that you can find online. This is from Impact 360 and just explains very briefly what we're going to outline.
To read ancient myths.
And of course, you want to start it at the beginning because
for no reason what
that makes more sense.
Dude,
Hey, what's up?
what you reading?
The Bible.
You're reading the Bible?
Yeah.
Dude, why are you reading the Bible? For class?
No, I just.
Okay, so you're just reading the Bible. You're just sitting here in a coffee shop in the 21st century using state-of-the-art technology to read ancient myths for no reason whatsoever. Tell
Well,
me something. Are you one of those super religious people who thinks Jesus actually rose from the dead?
I do believe
Do
that.
you also believe in the Easter Bunny, Santa Claus, unicorns, Bigfoot? Ever been abducted by aliens? And do you buy into all those other ancient myths about dying and rising gods invented by primitive nomadic tribes back in the Bronze Age?
No.
Okay, so what's the difference between Jesus rising from the dead and all those other fairy tales?
Here's the difference. My belief in the resurrection of Jesus is rational. It's based on historical facts.
Facts? What facts?
Well, first, Jesus died by crucifixion.
Whoa, hold on. We don't even know if Jesus existed. Why should I believe your facts?
Well, because the 5 facts I'm going to give you are backed by so much historical evidence that most professional critical scholars who study the subject accept them as true. That includes skeptical atheist scholars.
Okay, so Jesus was a guy who actually existed and then got himself killed. So what?
That's the first fact. Second, his disciples were convinced that he rose from the dead and appeared to them. Third, Paul, a sworn enemy of the early Christians, suddenly became a Christian. Fourth, Jesus' skeptical brother James also became a Christian. And fifth, the tomb where they put Jesus' body was empty.
And those are well-established historical facts.
Right, but you can't just leave it there. These facts demand an explanation. Otherwise, you've got a big hole in human history.
Okay, here's an explanation. They all lied. It was a conspiracy, the most monumental prank ever perpetrated. His followers stole his corpse from the tomb and then started telling everybody he was alive.
That's the conspiracy theory. The problem is it doesn't explain the facts. How do a few spineless fishermen, cringing in fear for their lives, subdue a bunch of well-armed, professional Roman guards, roll away a 2-ton stone, steal a body, then hide it from a city swarming with people trying to find it? And why would they do it? The disciples had absolutely nothing to gain by lying about Jesus' resurrection. In fact, they were persecuted, and we have good historical evidence that 5 of them were martyred because of their claim that Jesus rose from the dead. Apparently, not a single one of them ever recanted. People don't willingly die for something they know isn't true. They were there. They knew whether it was true or not.
All right, another theory. The disciples thought they saw Jesus alive after he died, but it was just wishful thinking. They were stressed and just kind of hallucinating.
The hallucination theory also lacks explanatory power. 500 witnesses saw Jesus at the same time, and the disciples touched him. Psychologists have shown that hallucinations don't work like that, nor does this explain the empty tomb.
Okay, look, maybe there's some other explanation, but the bottom line is dead people stay dead. Rising from the dead would be a supernatural event, a miracle, and science has proven that miracles don't happen.
Oh, really? When did that happen?
I don't know. I just kind of heard it somewhere.
Science has not disproven miracles. In fact, that would be impossible.
Why?
Science deals exclusively with natural phenomena, physical matter and material processes, right?
Yeah.
But a miracle, by definition, is not a natural phenomenon. It's supernatural.
So
So a supernatural event would lie outside the boundaries of science. It's logically impossible for science to throw out any hypothesis that lies outside its boundaries.
why have I never heard this stuff before?
I don't know, maybe because it's scary.
Scary.
Yeah, as long as Jesus rising from the dead is just a fairy tale, like Santa Claus and unicorns, it doesn't threaten my little world. But if it's a fact, if he actually did rise from the dead, that's huge. It's a total game changer. And that's why it's so hard to think about it objectively.
Whoa.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Big whoa.
All right, so that's a very brief explanation of what we're going to attempt to do. There's some things I like in that video and other things that I don't, because they explain the 5 facts, and then when the guy starts giving those objections, he doesn't actually appeal to those 5 facts. So that's something that, as we're doing this, we're going to kind of go back to the theories that he talked about of the swoon theory and the hallucination theory, and see why just from the 5 facts that we've used, that doesn't really explain the resurrection. So the first thing that we want to explain here is that we have a very modest goal. Once again, the slides are a little off. I wonder if I can change my settings here on this so that will fit better.
We've had no problem with all of with this screen that we've done so far.
Really? I guess I didn't notice it until last week. Okay. Well, yeah. Hopefully you guys can understand at least what I'm saying. I think there's only like one word that's cut off. So what we're doing in this argument is we're trying to convince people that the most non-biased and reasonable explanation for historical facts is that Jesus rose from the dead. So we're not saying this is an absolute proof. We're not saying that this is irrefutable. We're not saying that there isn't other explanations. What we are saying is, given the facts that we have, the most reasonable explanation of these facts is that Jesus actually rose from the dead. So non-biased, understanding that that means we're not simply dismissing an argument or source because it agrees with the resurrection, and is biased would be to dismiss a source because it agrees with the resurrection would be bias, because you're just saying, I'm not going to take that as a source because it's disagreeing with my viewpoint. And in that same sort of way, I can't dismiss sources that might say otherwise just because it disagrees with what I think. I need to just take the sources as they are. Reasonable, saying that just because there are other explanations does not mean that those are more reasonable. So one thing that we have to clarify in this, that there's a lot more that we could get into philosophically explaining why we cannot just philosophically say that there's a problem with miracles and miracles can't exist. David Hume is somebody that we have to deal with philosophically. Getting into this, I'm not going to touch on that very much right now, but just to hit on this briefly, Hume is basically going to kind of make the argument that the less an event or a type of thing occurs, the less likely it is and less reasonable it is to believe in that thing, and the more evidence that is required to prove that that thing actually happened. So that is good reasoning in a lot of ways, but we realize that there are events that we look back on that we would say are just very, very rare, that we wouldn't just dismiss as not existing just because of their rarity. So we could look at the Spartans when they as 500 guys took on the entire Persian military and nearly defeated them. That's something that in history, historians look back on and they're like, nothing ever, like there's these very rare events where a small army is able to take on such a large and massive army that should just be able to overwhelm and overpower them. But we have these examples of when that sort of thing happens. And so you cannot just say, well, it's super rare, so it just must not have happened. And we could also look at something just like a albino deer or other animals that have these weird genetic mutations that happen every now and then. I couldn't just dismiss those things as not existing because maybe we've never seen an example of them, or it's really, really rare. What we have to do is examine the evidence. Obviously, we have a photo of this albino deer. I can't just dismiss the evidence and say, well, that photo is biased to say that there's albino deer. I would have to give reasons and evidence that maybe this photo has been doctored or something like that. Another example, if any of you guys are sports fans, is when Virginia Tech got beat by a school, USBC. USBC was like unrated, but somehow made it into the national March Madness, which is the big basketball tournament every year for NCAA. So they're like unrated, bottom of the rank. They're playing against Virginia, who's supposed to win the whole thing. Nobody's ever heard of USBC. They've not even made it into the championship ever before. They make it to round 2 by some miracle. Now they go against Virginia. Everyone's just assuming game over, and they win. It's considered the biggest upset in maybe sports history, but definitely college sports history. Now, we can't just deny that and say that that didn't happen because it's so rare and so unlikely and all of these other things. We have to look at the evidence. We have these people that were eyewitnesses to it. We have video of it. We have all these different things that we can say, yeah, that really happened. As rare as that is, as unlikely as it may have been. So, where do we start? We start with these 5 facts. So, what we're saying is these 5 facts prove that Jesus rose from the dead. And again, we don't mean prove in the sense that like beyond a shadow of a doubt. What we're saying is we mean that given these facts, the most reasonable explanation of these facts is that Jesus rose from the dead. So, our sources. First of all, to show that we're not being biased in this, we are going to use a bunch of sources that are not Christian sources. Because ultimately I can bolster my view when I'm able to show here are sources that don't even agree with the event that I'm talking about in the long run, but some of the things that they talk about actually bolster the proof of the resurrection. So we have Josephus. Josephus is a Roman Jew, or he's a Roman citizen, Jewish man, writing history for the Romans. And so as that source, there's 2 reasons he would not want to write anything that would convince people that Jesus rose from the dead. Because as a Roman, Jesus is considered a king. He's considered king of the Jews. And so to call someone a king, anything that would make him sound good, that would make him sound like he is a king, isn't something that you're going to want to write down unless it's just the way it was. So if Jesus rose from the dead, that's something that he's not going to want to write down as a Roman. And then he's also not going to want to write it down as a Jew. We're not talking Christian Jew, because if we really understand it, we understand that Christianity is really kind of a Jewish sect, especially in this time. That's the way it was viewed. But he doesn't believe in Jesus being the Savior, being the Messiah. And so he's not going to write anything or want to write anything that's going to seem to prove that Jesus is that Messiah. So anything that he writes down that seems to bolster that idea that Jesus is king and the Messiah, which rising from the dead would be pretty convincing for both of those things, he's not going to want to write down. So we have him as one source. Tacitus is another one. He's a Roman senator and historian. So as a Roman, he wouldn't want to bolster that. Lucian is a satirist and rhetorician. Almost the rest of these guys are all going to be Romans as well. Marabar Serapion, he's a Roman Stoic philosopher. And then we also have the Jewish Talmud, which is basically Jewish commentary on the Old Testament. And this is also proclaiming some of the things about Jesus. And then we have Pliny the Younger, who's also a Roman author and a lawyer. So just to get straight to it, we're going to look at exactly what each of these guys wrote. So Josephus, this is what he wrote. At this time, there was a wise man named Jesus, and his conduct was very good. He was known to be virtuous. Many people among the Jews and other nations became his disciples. Pilate condemned him to be crucified. So not only is he giving us that he was crucified, he's giving us who declared that he needs to be crucified. So that's even giving us more evidence beyond the facts that we're even going to use. So Pilate condemned him to be crucified, but those who had become his disciples and did not abandon his discipleship, they reported that he had appeared to them 3 days after his crucifixion and that he was alive. Accordingly, he was perhaps the Messiah, concerning whom the prophets have reported wonders, and the tribe of Christians, so named after him, has not disappeared to this day. So that's what he writes. Then we have Tacitus. Tacitus writes, hence to suppress the rumor, he falsely charged with guilt and punished Christians. This is talking about Nero. Nero is punishing Christians who were hated for their enormities. Christus, the founder of the name, so Christ, was put to death by Pontius Pilate. So again, we have confirmation not only that he was killed, but who killed him. Procurator of Judea in the reign of Tiberius, but the pernicious, it's super small on my screen. Pernicious superstition, repressed by the time, broke out again, not only through Judea, where the mischief originated, but through the city of Rome also, where all things hideous and shameful, and from every part of the world, find their center and become popular. According, an arrest was made, first of all, who pleaded guilty. Then upon their information, the immense multitude was convicted, not so much for the crime of firing the city as the hatred against mankind. So this is explaining the beliefs of the Christians, how they got blamed for setting fire to Rome. This is how Nero kind of justified a lot of his persecution against the church. Lucian, he goes and he says, it was then he, Proteus, learned the wondrous lore of the Christians by associating with their priests and scribes in Palestine. And how else could he? In a trice, he, Proteus, made them all look like children, for he was a prophet, a cult leader, and head of a synagogue, and everything all by himself. He interpreted and explained some of their books and even composed many, and they revered him as a god, made use of him as a lawgiver, and set him down as protector. Next, after other, to be sure of whom, they still worship the man who was crucified in Palestine because he introduced this new cult into the world. So Lucian's kind of talking about these different stories of people who were leaders and then got proclaimed as gods. So he gives that sentence there where he says they still worship the man who was crucified in Palestine. He's referencing Jesus and saying, and now they worship Jesus as God. Then we have Marabar Serapion. What advantage did the Jews gain from executing their wise king? He was just after that their kingdom was abolished. God justly avenged these 3 wise men. So he talks about, he's been talking about basically these different leaders in different areas who were good men, were righteous men. One of them is Socrates, who is doing a lot for the people, and then the people themselves end up killing that person because that person seemed to be causing rebellion or revolt. And so he's putting Jesus in with one of these 3 characters. Socrates, I forget who the third guy is, and Jesus. The Jews, ruined and driven from their land, live in complete dispersion. So again, we're having that Jesus was killed, and now that he's even killed by the people in a sense. On the eve of Passover, this is the Jewish Talmud, Yeshu was hanged 40 days before the execution took place, a herald cried, "He is going forth and to be stoned, because he would practice sorcery and enticed Israel to apostasy." So there's somebody that proclaimed that Jesus is going to be stoned to death. He ends up being hanged, crucified. And so we're getting that also from these sources. Last of all, and we're not going to look at the word for word sources of the rest of these, but these are the most significant, I think, to see the exact words, because these are the non-Christian sources we're looking at. So last we have Pliny the Younger. They were in the habit of meeting on a certain fixed day before it was light, when they sang in alternate verses a hymn to Christ, as to a God, and bound themselves by a solemn oath, not to any wicked deeds, but never to commit any fraud, theft, or adultery, never to satisfy, never to falsify their word, or deny a trust when they should be called upon to deliver it, after which it was their custom to separate and then reassemble to partake of food, but food of an ordinary and innocent kind. So he's talking about the churches and how the churches respond, and how the churches are worshiping Jesus as God. So those are our first sources. Second sources that end up being really significant is early church fathers. So we have Polycarp, Ignatius, Clement of Rome, Tertullian, Origen, Clement of Alexandria, Hegesippus, or Jerome, whatever title you want to kind of give him. All of these also back up the facts that we're going to end up using for this. And what ends up being significant about these first three guys is these first three guys, look at the dates. So these are when they lived, from 35. So Ignatius and Clement of Rome were born on 35, which a lot of people are going to say that's actually the year that Jesus was crucified. So they're very close to the events. Whenever we're examining anything of history, one of the first things we're looking at is, are the sources close enough to the event to be reliable sources for what they're talking about? So if I wrote a story and it was something that happened the year I was born, if I wrote a story, Yellowstone had a huge fire in 1988 when I was born. Now, I'm obviously not going to remember that, but I'm definitely going to know somebody who did, right?
Like 9/11.
Right. Most of you guys would probably be 9/11, that sort of thing. You maybe don't remember it, but you definitely know people that did. And so you writing a story of what happened is not unrealistic. It'd be very reliable. And so these guys are extremely close to it. These guys are actually called the Apostolic Fathers. And the reason why is because these three guys actually knew the disciples themselves. They knew the original apostles. So Clement of Rome, he is probably actually a disciple of Paul, and he knows both Peter and Paul, and probably studied even a little bit under the rest of the disciples. Polycarp and Ignatius were direct disciples of John. So this is how close they are to the events. This is how close they are to eyewitnesses. So their testimony is hugely significant in that sense. And then as our last source, we're going to talk about the scripture. And notice what I'm doing here is I'm not putting Matthew, Mark, and Luke as separate sources, because there's some debate that maybe Mark wrote his first or Matthew wrote his first, and the other two gospels copied their information from the first one. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke are considered synoptic gospels, which just means a lot of their information is word for word the same. And there's a lot of theories of why that happened. We won't go in depth into that, because ultimately I think what we can do is just say, let's just count it as one source. And that's still good enough evidence for us to go on. Then we also have John as a separate source, and Paul and all of his writings, his epistles, as a separate source as well. So looking at early creeds regarding scriptures, this is also something that ends up being really interesting to all of this. So one of the things that we see earliest of all of our sources is this. It says, "Moreover, brethren, I declare unto you the gospel which was preached unto you, which also you have received, and wherein you stand, by which you were saved, if you keep the memory what I preached to you, unless you have believed in vain. For I delivered unto you what was given to me of first importance, how that Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures, that he was buried, and that he rose again on the third day according to the scriptures, and that he was seen of Cephas, then of the 12. After that, he was seen above 500 brethren at once, of whom the greater part remain unto the present day, but some have fallen asleep. After that, he was also seen by James, then all of the apostles, and then lastly it ends with, and last of all, me. This is 1 Corinthians 15, 1 through 9. Now, the significance of this, we might look at that and say, well, this is scripture. People might not take this as seriously because this is a biased source, okay? But this is significant compared to everything else because this is one of these early Christian creeds. You can see in that what I learned, I delivered of first importance to you. And it's kind of like a colon there. They don't have those punctuation marks, but what we understand is when we look through 1 Corinthians, Paul, his writing style, it's very choppy. He's not a good writer, just bluntly. But this passage becomes very poetic. Suddenly, all of a sudden, you're reading it in the original Greek and you're like, oh, that actually sounds really nice. And the rest of this was just like kind of jumbled and kind of choppy. And what that tips off to historians is Paul isn't writing himself here. He's quoting. Now, there wasn't any way that they put quotation marks in that day and age, but this is something that historians, Christian and not, look at and they say, this is Paul quoting something before he wrote. And so we even have somebody that will say these early creeds date to 1 to 2 years after the cross. That's how close they are to the events. And you might think that, oh, that's probably like a biased Christian scholar. Nope. That's Bart Ehrman. Bart Ehrman, of like all the critics to the Bible and trying to disprove the reliability of the scripture, Bart's their guy. That's who they go to. If the Muslims want to say that the Bible's not reliable, Bart's their guy. If the Mormons want to say that the Bible's been changed, Bart's their guy. If atheists want to say that the Bible is not reliable, Bart's their guy. And here he is saying that this creed and some other ones, I'm not sure what the other ones were, so I just put this one up, but we'll talk about some of the other Christian creeds. These creeds are 1 to 2 years after the crucifixion. So from the very get-go, there's no reason to think that this idea that Jesus rose from the dead was something that's just evolved over time. The earliest sources that we have believed that Jesus rose from the dead and that he was God from the very start. And so there's no reason to doubt that whatsoever. We also have sermons in the book of Acts that are believed to be summaries of early Christian teachings or that they're creeds in themselves. And so they even predate Acts itself. So sermons in Acts 1 through 5, Acts 10, when Paul is talking to Cornelius. We also have other creeds from 1 Corinthians. Well, I already gave that one. But also in Acts 9, for instance. Meanwhile, Saul was still breathing out murderous threats against the Lord's disciples. He went from the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogue in Damascus, so that if the prisoners so he found any there who belonged to the way, whether men or women, he might take them as prisoners to Jerusalem. As he neared Damascus on his journey, suddenly a light from heaven around him. He fell to the ground and heard a voice say to him, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? Who are you, Lord? I am Jesus, whom you were persecuting, he replied. And now get up and go into the city, and you will be told what to do. So even this is kind of viewed by many historians as being some sort of creed, that they're probably using that to give evidence to, hey, some of you guys don't believe. Paul is a dude that didn't believe just like you. This is exactly how it went down. So kind of memorize that in order to say it. Yeah.
Where do you think the idea that one?
I need to actually do some research on why that one specifically, because Luke is a good writer, unlike Paul. So it would be a little bit harder to distinguish that, but they're,
You can kind of see the Corinthians one, just because you know Paul notoriousness for Ron sentences
Uh-huh.
really stink and are difficult to understand. And you suddenly get that, and it's all nice and brief and quick.
Yeah, you're like, oh, I get it. Yeah, so, hey, that was really clear, and now I'm confused again right after that. Right. I would have to get some more research and get back to you on that. So, all of that to say, anytime we're examining just a source or anything of history to say whether it's a historical fact that this event occurred, some of the things that we're just going to look at is kind of this list of different things. This is something that we could look at from the perspective of just a investigator in general. So J. Warner Wallace, who was the ex-cold case detective who examined the Gospels to see whether or not those were true, using his cold case skills as someone who never lost a cold case in all of his career and became persuaded that Christianity was true. He's using some of the same sort of arguments to kind of examine whether or not we could believe the Bible saying that Jesus rose from the dead is reliable. So first of all, we're going to look at, we want early reports. Obviously, again, like the closer it is, the more reliable it is. We want eyewitness reports. Just because someone says it early doesn't make it true. But if someone was there, that makes it more reliable. Multiple independent attestations. So if just one person early on gives a testimony, that's good. But if you have a bunch of people saying it, that's even more reliable. The principle of embarrassment is something else. Any text you're just going to examine that, hey, if you're writing a story and you're making up a story, you're not going to put things in it that make yourself look bad. You're going to put things in it that make you look good. And so that's another thing that we're going to look at. And then lastly, one that a lot of people will get confused about. And oftentimes when you're talking with someone who's debating about whether or not, especially we can trust the Gospels themselves, they get mixed up as to say, well, if it's actually true, why don't they all say the exact same thing? But we know as investigators, if we had somebody investigating a crime and we had this group of suspects that were wondering, hey, these people might have been the ones that did it. And they all say the exact same story, exactly the same, of how they didn't do the crime, they throw those testimonies out. Because obviously what happened is that group of people, those suspects, got together and they said, this is our story. This is what we're going to tell everybody. Let's make sure we all agree on the facts. And then we'll tell that story. That'll be our testimony. So actually having a little bit of disagreement or at least different perspective is actually the best thing. And so that's what we have then when we look at the Gospels, and even whether it's just looking at the Synoptic Gospels or it's looking at all four of them inclusively, we see that they agree on the big facts and that they have a little bit of different perspective to it, but all of that can actually be lined up together to work succinctly. And that's what we should want if it's a reliable source. So all that mumbo jumbo, now just to get down to, here are the facts that we're going to examine with that. So the first thing that we're going to say is that Jesus died by crucifixion. Then that Jesus' followers believed he appeared to them after his death. Then that Saul of Tarsus, or Paul, believed Jesus appeared to him after his death. James, Jesus' brother, believed Jesus appeared to him after Jesus' death, and that the tomb was empty. So these first four facts, I actually have it highlighted weird, but it's actually these first four, so including the one about James. When we're talking about our other scholars, Christian scholars, non-Christian scholars, and asking them, do you believe in these facts, all of the ones that we presented? The first four, 90% of scholars agree on. 90%. Pretty much the only scholars that really disagree on this are two guys that deny that Jesus ever existed. Now, the other historians honestly just don't take any clout to those two guys. They basically say you're crazy to say that Jesus never existed. So the fact that the 10% that we have or whatever else are basically guys that are denying that Jesus ever existed. Those guys are not really seen as really good scholars in their field to begin with. So 90%, arguably more, actually believe these first four facts of scholars, Christian and non-Christian. This last fact, that the tomb was empty, we have 75% of scholars. So still wide majority of scholars agree that even that last fact is true. So one other thing that I think is kind of important to highlight, and that I think this is even something that's interesting to think about just when we're just doing apologetics altogether. So this approach is what I'm calling, or what is called, the minimal facts approach to the resurrection. There's all sorts of other facts that are pretty well attested by scholars that we could talk about. We could talk about how there's pretty good proof that the tomb that Jesus was put in was probably a tomb in the traditional time for a more rich person, Joseph of Arimathea, which means that there's a big stone that's probably a 2-ton stone that's put in front of the tomb that would make it very hard for the disciples to move the stone. That would be some more evidence that we could use, but we're not going to talk about that. We're not going to bring that up in conversation. We could talk about the reasons why we believe that there's a Roman guard that was posted in front of the tomb and how that now has to also be accounted for with any theories that are trying to explain how Jesus didn't actually rise from the dead. But we're not going to bring that up. And here's the reasons why. Because ultimately, anytime that you can just concede ground and still prove your point, I think is a good tactic to take, just from a rhetorical perspective. So what this allows you to do is you don't get lost in the weeds. In essence, you're able to keep things simple. So as an example, this week I ran into someone who is a progressive Christian, and they basically said, there's no way that Jesus believes in heaven or hell because none of the Jews at Jesus' time believed in heaven or hell. That was their argument. Okay, so I could take the tactic in talking with them to say, well, I disagree. I think there's some Jews that really did believe that heaven and hell existed, and we could debate about that. And I think there's some good evidence for it. I haven't examined that wholly, but I think there's some pretty good evidence that there were plenty of Jews that believed that heaven and hell existed during Jesus' time. But instead of arguing that point, I'm going to concede that point and just say, let's say you're right, that no Jews believe that heaven and hell existed during Jesus' time. Does that mean Jesus didn't believe in heaven and hell? No. I can concede that point to them and still win the ultimate thing that I'm trying to get to. So I can concede that the Roman guard didn't exist. I could concede that there wasn't a 2-ton stone, and I could still show them that the best evidence points to Jesus actually rose from the dead. So I don't get lost in the weeds. I don't now have to prove to them those other facts. It ends up being a red herring that takes us off the point that I want to get to. The point I want to get to is that Jesus did believe in heaven and hell, or that Jesus did rise from the dead. So instead of letting myself get lost on that, I stay focused on my target. Rhetorically, it makes your argument look stronger, because if I can prove to them, hey, Jesus did believe in heaven and hell, because we're going to look at what the Bible actually says and what Jesus himself said, he did believe in that, and I've proven my point that way. Now I can go back and say, see, I've proven you're wrong about that. And also, to make that point even stronger, now let's talk about how the Jews, some of them, did believe in heaven and hell. Or in this case, I can say, all right, let's say the 2-ton stone wasn't there. I can still prove to you that Jesus rose from the dead. Convince them of that. Now I can go back and still say, to bolster that point even more, this is how I know a 2-ton stone was there. So I'm able to make that way stronger that way. We also say, with what is unanimously or almost unanimously agreed upon. So the facts that we've already presented, almost all scholars, or the wide majority of scholars, agree on. So there's not room to kind of fight as much. when that happens. Anytime you can make an argument based upon premises that are agreed upon, even by your opponent, it's probably good to lead with that argument. And lastly, it can highlight that someone's objection to your conclusion is not well reasoned, or it is biased, or has an a priori assumption. So by sticking with these minimal facts, I think what we end up doing is showing someone that's saying, I don't think Jesus rose from the dead. Their reason for rejecting in that isn't based upon the facts around the resurrection. It's based upon the fact that maybe they don't believe that God exists. Because obviously, and this is why we take the approach that we do in apologetics, this is why we do classical apologetics rather than evidential apologetics, where I could give a great argument for Jesus rising from the dead, but in the end, they're just going to say, I don't believe in God, so there must be a naturalistic explanation for it. Okay, that's fine. But understand your reason for objection to Jesus rising from the dead has nothing to do with the facts around the event of the resurrection. It has to do with your rejection of God altogether. So let's talk about that and stay there for a minute. It allows us to focus in, because a lot of times people will throw out, hey, we're talking about Jesus, we're talking about how I know God exists, and then all of a sudden they want to argue about the resurrection. And we can use this argument really quickly, succinctly show them, hey, your reason for rejecting this is rooted in that you don't believe God exists. So let's actually set camp there, and let's argue through that before we go back to the resurrection. So each of these facts have different sources that we can look at to prove that. We've already read the sources, so we're going to go a little bit faster here now. Fact number 1, Jesus died of crucifixion. The sources that we have for that is Josephus, Tacitus, Lucian, Marabas Serapion, the Jewish Talmud, John, and the Synoptic Gospels. All of those agree with that. I actually should go back into that list and also list the apostolic fathers or the early church fathers as well. What skeptics have to say. Even Bart Ehrman says skeptics who are not trained might doubt that Jesus died on a cross, but to any trained scholar, it is well attested as any historical fact. As well attested as any historical fact. Here's a skeptic saying that this is something that no historian disagrees on. He also says no reputed scholar denies that Jesus dies on the cross. John Dominic Crossan, who's also a skeptic, says the death of Jesus is as well attested as any fact in the ancient world. And Marcus Borg, last of all, another skeptic, says Jesus died for being a political rebel. Fact number 2, the disciples believe that he rose from the dead. So we're going to have sources about this from Josephus himself. We saw that earlier. Some of the other ones I should also list there. But then there's the acronym POW that we can kind of use to remember this. So we have Paul from 1 Corinthians. That's the creed that we mentioned before. Oral tradition from the creeds in that. Some of the sermon summaries in Acts. And then the written tradition, both in the Gospels and the apostolic fathers like Clement and Polycarp. All of those prove that as well. We also know that they really did believe that because they were willing to die for that belief. You don't die for something that you know is a lie, especially when you're not gaining anything good from it. And we have that recorded, that they believed and they were willing to suffer and die, both in the book of Acts, from Clement of Rome, Ignatius, Dionysius of Corinth, Tertullian, and Origen. Fact number 3, Paul believed he saw Jesus. We have that conversion recorded in Paul's writing, both in Luke and in Acts, by Luke in Acts. And then we also have that recorded of his suffering and martyrdom by Paul, the book of Luke in Acts, or the book of Acts by Luke, Clement of Rome, Polycarp, Tertullian, Dionysius of Corinth, and Origen. Specifically Clement of Rome. Now again, Clement, he's one of the disciples. He is not an eyewitness himself, but he knows people who are eyewitnesses. Owing to envy, Paul also obtained the reward of patient endurance after being 7 times thrown into captivity, compelled to flee, and stoned. After preaching both in the East and the West, he gained the illustrious reputation to his faith, having taught the righteousness to the whole world and come to the extreme limit of the West and suffered martyrdom under the prefects. Thus, was he removed from the world and went into the holy place, having proved himself a striking example of patience. Fact number 4, James believed he saw Jesus. We see that before he did not believe, recorded in pretty much all of the Gospels, or the early creeds report that Jesus appeared to James, one of those creeds being the creed that we read in 1 Corinthians, being something that was probably written as late as 2 years, probably earlier, after Jesus' crucifixion. We also see that recorded in Acts and by Paul. His martyrdom is reported by Josephus, by Hegesippus or Jerome, and Clement of Alexandria. For even his own brothers did not believe him in John 7:5. I saw none of the other apostles, only James, the Lord's brother. What?
That was fact. I've always wondered why James was considered Jesus' brother.
Yep. After that, he was same of James and of all the apostles. So some other things to look at. What do the skeptics say? I have no problem saying that the disciples had experiences as a fact of history. So Bart is not denying that the disciples had experiences of Jesus appearing. What those experiences were, he would argue. But he's not denying that those experiences happened. Teaching the resurrection message dates to immediately after the cross. Larry Hurtado, who's another source. Brought before them the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ. So here's even Josephus. This is not a Christian source, remember? Brought before them the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, whose name was James. So there's another way that we know that James is considered Jesus' brother. And some others, or some of his companions. And when he had formed an accusation against them as breakers of the law, he delivered them to be stoned. So that's how well we have that attested, which is something that I don't know how the Catholics try to reason that Jesus didn't have any brothers. This is one thing that I don't. Maybe we'll talk about this afterwards because maybe you guys know. I'd be interested to hear. Fact that the tomb was empty. Fact number 5. 1, we have the Jerusalem factor. If one of us died, we all went to the funeral and that person was buried. And then one of us 3 days later came and said, hey, Alex rose from the dead after Noah killed him because he was so annoyed at him. Because we know that's all we know that sooner or later it's going to happen. If some of you started to come and say, well, he rose from the dead, what are we going to do? What is one of the first things we're going to do? We don't know where Alex is supposedly risen from the dead, but what is one way we could examine whether or not he has?
Find my dead body.
Find the body. We all know where you were buried. So we go to the tomb, we go to the coffin, we open it up. Well, the body's still there. You parade it through the streets. Nobody else is going to say that Jesus rose from the dead anymore. Rumor's over. We don't have any reason to think anything like that ever happened. And the fact that it continued to get proclaimed that Jesus actually rose from the dead is really good reason to think that must not have happened. Secondly, we have enemy attestation. The Jews told the soldiers to tell them the disciples stole the body. There's no reason for them to make up this story unless the tomb itself was empty. Somebody's saying that Alex rose from the dead. Tell them all that the disciples stole the body. And the Roman soldiers would just be like, we have the body. Why don't we just show them the body? But the enemies are saying, this is what you need to tell everybody. You're not going to make up a lie when you have evidence of the truth that you could just proclaim to everybody. And last of all, and this is where it gets a little sexist, but it's just true to the time period. The testimony of the women. Women's testimony in that culture wasn't credible. So they would not mention it unless that's just really what happened. The women are the first one to discover that the tomb is empty. You, if you're making up a story, are not going to take the women in that time period and say, yeah, well, who told you that the tomb was empty? The women did. Like in our culture, the closest that would be, honestly, would be like, hey, how do you know that Alex rose from the dead? Oh, well, I talked with the meth addict down the road. He told me. What? Like, no one's going to believe that. Like, honestly, it was a woman's testimony in a court of law just meant nothing. If there was no one else to testify, okay, maybe. But even that probably just isn't going to have much credence to it. If you had an 8-year-old boy, you would take his testimony over a full-grown woman any day in that culture. And there's so much, like, that's not something that we're just saying. There's all sorts of evidence that we could point to of reasons why we just know through court documents and everything else, basically saying like, yeah, just don't use a woman's testimony. It means nothing. So all of that just proves the tomb must have been empty, because anything else just doesn't make sense. So now the argument is, well, what about other views? Couldn't one of these, or maybe a combination of these, explain it? So the different theories, we have the swoon theory. Jesus didn't really actually die. He was up on the cross. The disciples fought against it, talked with Pilate. Pilate agreed to let Jesus off the cross, got him off before he died, or somehow the Roman soldiers didn't recognize the signs of death, and they took him off before he was dead, and they put him in a tomb, and he survived. That's one idea. What would be the problems with that? We're going to make it a little interactive today.
Roman soldiers are kind of good at killing people. Just a little bit.
Yeah. So for one, Roman soldiers, if there's anybody that recognizes the signs of death in that time period, it's your soldiers. They know when somebody's dead. Not to mention when we understand the punishment and how brutal Roman soldiers and enforcement was for getting something like that wrong. You want to know what would be the punishment if you took somebody off the cross before they were dead and they were supposed to get capital punishment and die? Death. I'm going to make sure he's dead. I'm not going to be like, he's mostly dead. Like, this is not Princess Bride. You're going to make darn sure. And they did. Like, that's another part of it, is part of the testimony that we see. And granted, we're getting a little off from our 5 facts, but they stuck a spear into his side. So let's even say that we ignore the Roman guard. How else would this not add up?
He was given, Jews limited it to 40 lashes, but with Jesus, since he was put under a Roman execution, they could have as many lashes as they want. He wasn't strong enough to carry the cross out.
Okay.
After having all that, what they used was a cat and nine tails, so it basically has like stones and these sharp pieces of glasses woven into it, so it rips all the way down to muscle and even bone.
Mm-hmm.
At that point, there's so much blood and gore. And then they also put him in a purple robe and ripped it off, which just rips off all of that again and opens it up, because once the blood hardens and the robe's on there, it clots, and then it's like pulling off a giant Band-Aid.
Great.
So once you've got all that, then you add to it the agony of the cross, and you add to it a spear through your side. Modern medical science is going to say that you just really can't survive that.
Well, you take into consideration where they put the nails, you only hit some kind of artery, you would bleed out.
Right.
The giant spears are going to your head from the crown, they would probably make you bleed out.
Okay.
And then getting stabbed in the side for good measure.
Yeah, and then modern medical science also tells us about when the spear comes in, you have water and blood come out. It has to do with piercing that human epicardium or something, sac on the heart. And that's what would build up in the heart once you're dead, is a bunch of blood and water on the cross.
Okay.
So all of the facts seem to add up really well for that. So those are older facts, I guess I'm not doing our minimum facts.
Yeah, you want to jump
Given
in?
all of that he went through, if he just wasn't actually dead on the cross, he'd be really close to it, and everyone would be able to tell.
And then
Yeah.
you put a 2
So-
or 3 days without food and water and walked out.
Right. All good facts that you're bringing in. But if we stick with our minimal facts, you just presented a bunch of data that now I'm going to argue. I'm just going to say, well, we don't really know if the Romans were the one that did it. We don't really know if he really got those 40 lashes, or that they put the robe on, or that he couldn't carry his own cross. We don't know any of that. What we know is that he was crucified by Pontius Pilate.
Oh, it wouldn't convince Paul and James then.
It wouldn't convince Paul and James. Plus, would it really even convince the disciples? Here's a guy that someone in the group would have at least been able to say he's dead. Even if it's not the Roman soldiers who would know, because they're Roman soldiers and are familiar with death. He's so close to death that most people are being convinced this dude's dead. Are the disciples are all of a sudden going to be like, Jesus knocks on the door, like somehow, however you want to account for the rest of the data, he gets out of the tomb, he goes to where the disciples are, he knocks on the door, somehow had mustered up enough strength to do all of that, and he shows up. Is he really going to convince the disciples that he rose? Or would they just be like, holy crap, he was not dead? They're just going to be like, that was a really close call. That's the way they're going to look at it. Are they going to die proclaiming that Jesus rose from the dead? No. They're going to be like, he got really close to death, but they're not going to say that he rose from the dead.
So say it's fact number 1 because of the medical stuff, right? 'Cause
Well,
the fact that Jesus died on the cross is all the
Right.
medical stuff.
I mean, ultimately, you're ignoring our first fact that just the facts, one of the facts is just simply he did die. You're just completely throwing that to the side. And nearly every historical scholar agrees to it. And we have more sources of all the facts that we have. That source is the one that's like the most, that fact is the one that's most sourced. Because all of these different ones, not just proclaiming that he died, but who's the one that called him to be crucified? That Pontius Pilate was the one that sent him to be crucified. And now you're just going to say, I'm going to throw that out. You got to give a good reason for that. So what about the next one? The disciples stole the body. There's two different ways that could, or a stolen body. Either you could have the disciples stole the body, or just some people just were like, hey, this would be funny. You know, we know that Jesus has been stirring some things between the rest of the Jews. Let's steal the body and everyone will wonder what the heck is going on. It'll be hilarious. What about those two theories?
Well, who appeared to the disciples?
Who would have appeared to the disciples? Exactly. Nobody's there to convince. They'd be wondering where the heck the body is. Probably pretty irritated about it. But no reason that they're going to start believing that Jesus rose from the dead.
And Paul and James are still out too.
And Paul and James had no reason to believe. Still, they'd just be like, well, that sucks. Paul actually be pretty happy about it because he's persecuting the church before this. So he'd be like, oh, that's the end of that movement. What about the hallucination theory? This is the theory that either the disciples or maybe the disciples and James and Paul all had hallucinations of Jesus rising from the dead. Yep.
Why not show the body?
Show the body. You still have the problem of an empty tomb. So you just have this group of people that are crazy proclaiming that Alex rose from the dead. And everyone's like, yeah, tomb's still full. You can say whatever you want, give whatever evidences you want, but we have the evidence right here. Game over. Plus, when we're talking about the disciples themselves, just with how hallucinations work, if all of us in this room got a bunch of shrooms and started hallucinating today. Actually, it's funny. There was somebody I was talking to on campus the other day that was even saying I should try shrooms. Great conversation. Would we all imagine the same thing?
No way. I want a dragon.
Just from a scientific perspective, when people hallucinate things, they don't hallucinate the same
Maybe
thing.
we should just like try it, just to make sure. You know?
Yeah.
It's a great plan.
Yeah, right here in church. Get some shrooms next week, guys. No. You all imagine different things, and the earliest source that we have, that creed that Paul writes down in 1 Corinthians, says that 500 people saw him at once. And they're all saying the same thing about what they saw. If you're going on some sort of big like hallucinogenic trip, and then afterwards you talk about what you experienced, and you realize Alan and I, or Alex, Alan and I, all experience different things, you realize, okay, I saw that, but clearly that wasn't true. Because they didn't see the same thing as me. Or at least they were tripping, but I wasn't.
As evidenced by the great number of religions started on people who had strange religions.
So all of that doesn't explain it then. The hallucination doesn't explain it. Then you have the replacement theory. This is one that the Gospel of Barnabas, Gnostic gospel, is going to proclaim. This is what some Muslims will actually go with, is that Jesus wasn't actually the person that went on the cross. Somebody else went instead of him, in place of him. What do you do with that?
And then he decided, for the heck of it, and for fun, to just, stab himself and put the nails in his wrist for the proof of it.
Yeah. So we have Thomas, who's like, show me the scars. Jesus is just gonna like take a little pin or something, be like, see? No, Thomas is gonna be like, something's not adding up here. What about Paul? Paul didn't believe to begin with. He hears everybody saying that Jesus rose from the dead. He's not convinced. And then we have James as well. Everyone's telling James he rose from the dead, but he ends up being convinced. It's going to take more than just Jesus showing up perfectly healed. It's going to take probably some very clear evidence. What?
Would they have a body problem? Or could they get away with that?
Well, yeah, they would have some sort of way like, hey, okay, well then who did we kill? And from what we understand, because part of the reason why we know that the grave is empty is because it wasn't just some random grave. It was Joseph of Arimathea's grave. Everybody knows where it is, or at least it would be public knowledge, be easily accessed. Maybe not everybody knows where his family tomb is, but it'd be easy information to find out. And they go find the tomb, look at the body, and be like, oh yeah, that guy looked a lot like Jesus. We crucified the wrong guy. Try again. That's what would happen. And so that doesn't make sense either. And then lastly, we have, I kind of gave it away already, the theory that Jesus was just buried in a common grave. Typically when somebody's crucified, it's other people don't really care about. You take them off the cross, you throw them in a big grave with a bunch of other people. What's the problem with that idea?
Seems still kind of have a problem with the empty tomb, in the sense that, like, okay, I mean, it's already weird because a lot of the core things that bolster the empty tomb fact, suddenly you're just throwing out the window. Because a lot of those
Right.
bolster the one special tomb uniquely.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, but the common phrase is only about the empty tomb. So you can still concede. You could even concede that, and it doesn't. Who cares if it doesn't make any difference to
So
Because he's still dead.
he's still dead.
He's just in an unknown tomb.
Right. How does that convince the disciples? The tomb's just, you're claiming the tomb wasn't empty, essentially is what you're trying to say. Claiming the tomb's not empty, okay? The disciples realize the tomb's not empty. Great. I don't think that's even the disciples are going to be like, he rose from the dead, the tomb's empty. No, they'd be like, all right, where is he? Where's the body? Or where is he if he's supposedly alive? Definitely doesn't account for James, and it definitely doesn't account for Paul. So all of these theories in the end have huge shortfalls. And granted, people are going to get more ornate than that. They're going to say, well, he didn't really die, and the disciples, or like the tomb was empty, and then the disciples had hallucinations. So you're going to start combining all of these different things together. But in the end, all of these theories end up having these issues, even when you start combining. And it just, in the end, what you see people are doing are clearly making these crazy things. And their reason, again, in the end is showing your reason for rejecting it isn't because you don't think the facts agree with it. It's because you just don't want it to be true that Jesus rose from the dead. You want to say that that can't be possible. And so we need to talk about your reasons for rejecting that that's not possible. Because the best thing, the thing that accounts for all of these, the best, the most reasonable explanation of these facts is that Jesus actually rose from the dead. And the only way you can say otherwise is if you're bringing in a priori assumptions into the fact before. So the guy who is most known for this, why am I blanking on his name right now? Gary Habermas. He's the one that's kind of put this all together. Him and Mike Licona are probably the top scholars on the resurrection in the world right now. And when Gary Habermas has a debate with someone anymore about the resurrection, it's fascinating to see. He presents his facts, and then he asks, what other things give an explanation? And for a while, people that debated him would start to give, here's another way. The hallucination theory combined with the empty tomb, or the common grave, and all of these other different things. But after a while, people started to watch the debates before they debated him, and they don't throw out other theories anymore because he just rips them to shreds. Because there's no other explanation that fits. This is the only one that accounts for the data well. This is clearly the most reasonable explanation. So that's all I got. There's other things that we're going to talk about next week. Other reasons that we know Jesus is God. This to me is my favorite, but there's some other cool things to talk about that we'll talk about next week. Questions?
Which combination of theories do you think is the best? Do you think that if you combine them, they just get more and more against the fundamental facts?
Well, there's a bit that Occam's razor starts coming in of just like, clearly you're just like pulling at, grasping at straws to get whatever you can, making this as complicated and as ornate as you can. But I would say probably the best that I would say is a combination of saying that that there's a common grave, because you have to account for that. And so that would make sense, because part of what the common grave has ended up saying is the reason they're not able to produce the body is because there's all these other bodies in the tomb, in the grave, and you're just not going to be able to find Jesus' body. And so that's why they don't produce the body. So I think that combined with some level of hallucination theory, and then maybe throwing in somehow trying to say that Paul gained something from lying about it. Because I think Paul ends up being really the biggest problem to this. James, I think, as being someone who's a skeptic before, becomes a little hard to reason for sure. But Paul, especially, where he goes from someone who's clearly moving up the ranks in the Jewish people, among the Jewish people and religious leaders at the time, going from he's moving up the ranks in the higher powered religious group to leaving them and joining the one that everyone's fighting, that everyone's persecuting. And so somehow trying, and that's, I think, the biggest flaw that ends up being with that, which I think is the best one that people have, is why? There's no reason why Paul is going to abandon his growth into leadership, and then all of a sudden become a Christian. He had everything to lose from that and nothing to gain. And that's, again, one of the things that we just look at whenever we're examining sources is what would be their motivation for lying about this? And the typical things that we look at with any crime is, do you gain power, money, or sex? That's the motivations for any crime. Any crime, you can narrow it down to those things or all. But Paul becomes a Christian, then rejects the idea that he should get married, basically to say, I want to dedicate fully to the ministry, where he could have been married and fully dedicated to the ministry as a Jewish person. Now he has to abandon, or he decides to abandon that. And he's not gaining material wealth by any means. He's traveling around the world, and that's not working out. And he's not gaining power. He's getting arrested. We see the testimony of even Josephus specifically saying what Paul went through. And it just doesn't add up. So that's the best I think they got. But it's clearly sucks. Any other thoughts, questions? Yeah.
Yeah, I just think that the non-Christian sources were a little weak.
Okay.
Because none of the sources explicitly state. So many of them explicitly stated that Jesus was crucified, and maybe that was the point, and maybe I misunderstood.
Right. For
But
those
none of them-
facts, yes.
None of them testified that they saw him. They testified that other people saw him. Like one of them was like, "Oh, 500 people saw him." Well, maybe I'm misunderstanding.
Josephus says that James believed he saw him.
Yeah. See, he believed that somebody else saw him.
No,
No.
Josephus says that James believed he saw Jesus.
And Josephus says James believes he himself saw Jesus. So
So
he's
Josephus
it's like I
believes-
was describing. If I say Alex believed he saw you, I'm saying Alex thought he himself saw you, right? And that's what he's saying about James. Is he saying James himself believes he saw Jesus? Josephus maybe
Yeah.
believed it.
So my question was, nobody that was actually, I take it back. Paul was a non-believer,
Right.
and he saw Jesus, and now he is.
Right. So I think, and this is, I think maybe part of what you're kind of getting at is you don't have any non-believers saying that Jesus rose from the dead.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
but
the
there was
problem
a
with
believer.
that is
When-
if I believe someone rose from the dead,
Right.
am I going to continue to be a skeptic?
Yeah. No, I definitely see my flaw
Right.
in reasoning there now.
Yeah.
Because both
So-
James and Paul were skeptics.
Right.
And
They
both
were.
of them- yeah, and both of them came back.
Right.
So it would make sense that we have
Yeah.
nobody saying, "Oh, I saw him rise from the dead," but I still don't think he got
Right.
it. Like, you know.
Yeah. All of you guys are telling me Alex rose from the dead. I don't believe it. I see him. Nah, I still don't believe it. Like you'd be like, okay, that guy's just an idiot now.
Probably not writing nice ancient history.
Yeah, like now I don't trust that person as a reasonable source because you're saying that this thing happened and saying you don't believe it happened.
Exactly.
Right. Yep. But you will get that argument.
Yeah.
A lot of times I will get that argument from people of like, well, there's nobody who didn't believe it that write down that it happened. Okay, like what?
Yeah.
That's just any like if I were to say Julius Caesar never existed. Well, I don't think Julius Caesar ever existed because there's no historian that writes of him being a historical person that didn't believe he was a historical person.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. Like that's kind of the point.
Mhm.
Any other thoughts, questions, concerns, cussings? We're live. You can't cuss.
I
Really?
don't Catholic, something to
We
Catholic,
can discuss
not-
that later. But,
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, normally if you want to add a fourth category, you can add snide remarks. as the fourth-
Snide remarks.
Fourth category.
I'll remember that one.
A question, comments, concerns, or snide remarks.
Yeah. Okay. We good? Clear as mud?
Uh-huh.
No, wait, what about the Catholic?
I'll cut the feed. Let's go to that. I am interested if you guys know the reasons.
What was that though? I don't remember what the.